I'm happy with myself right now. I'm happy with what I've got.
She was barely a teenager. He was a rock and roll legend at the height of his fame. Together, they ignited one of the most shocking scandals in music history. But what the world saw was only the beginning. Jerry Lee Lewis's child bride, Myra Gale Brown, lived a hidden nightmare that no headline ever captured. Now, after decades of silence, she's finally breaking her silence to expose the ultimate betrayal, the affair that shattered everything she tried to protect. Fans thought they knew the story, but what Myra reveals will make you question everything you believed. The truth is darker, deeper, and it's time you heard it. The scandalous start. In December 1957, rock and roll icon Jerry Lee Lewis shocked the world when he married Myra Gale Brown, who was only 13 years old at the time. The marriage occurred at a moment when Lewis's career was on the rise, making headlines for his electrifying piano performances and rebellious persona. But no amount of musical talent could shield him from the outrage that erupted once the truth of his bride's age came to light. Though the marriage was technically legal in Mississippi with parental consent, it challenged deeply held moral boundaries and ignited a firestorm of criticism that would reshape Lewis's public image forever. Myra was not just startlingly young, she was still a child in every practical and emotional sense. At only 13, she had barely left middle school and had no real concept of adulthood, let alone the responsibilities of marriage. Lewis, then 22 years old, was nearly a decade her senior and already a seasoned performer with experience and influence. In most states, such a marriage would have been illegal due to age of consent laws, and even in those where it wasn't, it was highly controversial. Many observers viewed the union as an abuse of power and a profound failure of moral judgment on Lewis's part. In the beginning, Lewis and his people tried to keep this marriage a secret because they knew very well that it would not be welcomed by the outside world. Eventually, in a press tour in the UK in 1958, the truth came out. When reporters inquired about it, he claimed Myra was 15 years old at first. Within no time, the lie fell apart, and when it became known that she was under serious age exposure, and the fact that she was the first cousin once removed during a backlash, it was immediate and intense. The British media condemned Lewis, and the same resulted in a decisive cancellation of his tour. The change in public opinion that turned overnight transformed him from a celebrated rock rebel into a social pariah. Myra's age was not merely startling to fans. It was a cultural eye-opener on how celebrities act, the protection of children, and the power matters in a relationship. Once regarded as quirkiness or Southern tradition, it was now seen in a much more critical light. Myra's marriage had brought childhood to an end, forcing a young woman into a world of adulthood for which she was woefully unprepared. Satisfaction was thus earned, and this marked the beginning of a long term where Jerry Lee Lewis drew public censure, a scandal that was to haunt his legacy through the decades. As the public reeled from the shock of Myra's age, an even more unsettling detail was waiting to ignite the outrage into a full-blown firestorm: a family affair. The controversial marriage between Jerry Lee Lewis and Myra Gale Brown was not only scandalous because of her young age, but also because of their close blood relation. Myra was Lewis's first cousin once removed. Her father, J.W. Brown, was Jerry Lee's first cousin. This detail, once revealed to the public, intensified an already explosive situation. The familial connection introduced a disturbing layer of intimacy that many found deeply unsettling, especially when combined with Myra's youth. Even in an era where marriage laws varied widely across the U.S., unions between such close relatives were culturally frowned upon and, in some places, outright illegal. In Mississippi, where the marriage took place, the law allowed for marriages between cousins, and with parental consent, Myra's age did not prevent the marriage from being recognized by the state. Legally, they were within their rights. Socially, however, the backlash was fierce. The idea that a rising music star would marry not just a minor, but a close family member, horrified the public and media alike. The perception was not just that the marriage was inappropriate, it was morally incomprehensible to many. It raised questions about family boundaries, parental judgment, and Lewis's own sense of responsibility and propriety. The scandal erupted across both shores of the Atlantic following the marriage. Already criticized for the age difference and Myra's youthfulness, the press and public briefly felt the outrage turn white-hot when they learned of the consanguinity. British papers, already incensed by Myra's deception of age, took the cousin relationship as further indictment of Lewis's character. A private relationship that might have been endured became now nothing short of a calculated affront to social mores. Lewis was called morally corrupt by the media. The scandal cost him his career momentum at a most crucial point. The relationship that went on to symbolically represent the deeper dysfunctionality surrounding the marriage put the far-reaching legal loopholes and cultural contradictions to the test, where fame could assuage accountability, but only up to a point under the spotlight. Because of Myra being kin to Lewis, the marriage could not merely be dismissed as a Southern quirk or a misunderstood love story. It became a lightning rod for criticism and forced both its fans and critics to think again about their support for Lewis. In its conjoining of youth and kinship, the traditional writing of this incident represents an intense public betrayal, one which social mores were beginning to stretch quite a bit by society music icon or nun. Secrets and lies. In the early months following Jerry Lee Lewis's marriage to Myra Gale Brown, secrecy was the couple's primary defense against scandal. The marriage, which took place in December 1957, was kept under wraps not only from fans, but also from the people closest to Lewis's professional life, his record label, tour managers, and concert promoters. At the time, Lewis was preparing for a major tour of the United Kingdom, a key opportunity to expand his fame internationally. His team likely feared that revealing the marriage, especially given Myra's age and their familial connection, would provoke controversy and jeopardize his rising career. That concern proved to be well-founded. The truth began to unravel just months later during a highly publicized 1958 press conference in London. British reporters, known for their aggressive journalism, began questioning Lewis about rumors of his marriage. When pressed on Myra's age, Lewis responded that she was 15, already problematic, but less alarming than the reality. That lie, however, was short-lived. British journalists swiftly discovered not only that Myra was just 13, but also that she was his first cousin once removed. These revelations were explosive and ignited a media storm that spread like wildfire across international headlines. The fallout was swift and furious. Heavy condemnation from British newspapers was leveled at Lewis, regarding which they termed as falling short of a moral disgrace and a cultural insult. And the UK public is less tolerant of child marriages and much less of consanguineous unions when compared to some states in America, responded with outrage. Audiences who were to buy tickets to the young rock star were now calling for boycotts. The pressure mounted on promoters, and within days, the tour was cancelled. It started on a very short note of 3 performances. This incident not only wrecked his career in Britain, but it also sent ripples back across the pond as public opinion quickly began to swing against him in his homeland. The marriage cover-up had an extremely damaging fallout. What appeared to be a private matter with manageable consequences became an affair of international scandal, exactly due to the lies that concealed its concealment. The whole affair heavily dented Lewis's credibility, where both fans and industry insiders questioned his integrity, judgment, and suitability as a public figure. His very attempt to deceive both the public and the press made it almost impossible for him to redeem himself. Within days, Lewis went from being a rock pioneer to a disgraced celebrity, brought down not only by his choices, but by his attempt to keep them hidden. Career in freefall. The exposure of Jerry Lee Lewis's marriage to 13-year-old Myra Gale Brown and the revelation of their family connection triggered an immediate and dramatic collapse of his once promising career. At the time, Lewis was at the pinnacle of his fame, with hit songs like Great Balls of Fire and Whole Lotta Shakin' Goin' On, propelling him into the upper ranks of rock and roll stardom. His 1958 UK tour was intended to solidify his status as an international sensation, with sold-out venues and high-profile appearances. However, the scandal cut that dream short. After only 3 performances, overwhelming public outrage forced promoters to cancel the remainder of the tour, and Lewis returned to the United States in disgrace. The backlash did not stop at canceled concerts. In both the United Kingdom and the United States, major radio stations swiftly removed Lewis's songs from their playlists. What had once been constant radio staples virtually disappeared overnight. His records, once chart toppers, stalled or plummeted from the rankings as stations refused to give them airtime. The music industry, eager to distance itself from the controversy, contributed to silencing Lewis's previously booming presence. Without radio support, his new releases struggled to find audiences, and the momentum of his chart success came to a screeching halt. The financial ramifications were mind-boggling. Before the scandal broke, Lewis would command up to $10,000 for his performances, a hefty sum back then for any musician, much more so for a rock and roll artist at the peak of his powers. After the scandal, his nightly performance fee dropped to just $250, a swift decline reflecting not just the lost demand, but also the damage done to the Lewis brand. Bookings diminished as promoters avoided affiliation with the tarnished name of Lewis. They had feared protest and negative press. This meteoric rise was sounding more and more like a cautionary tale on how fast fame can fade in the face of public disapproval. Loss for Lewis was not only a loss of money, but also a kind of loss of face. He was blacklisted from the mainstream media. No television show or radio program would have him. Some of his own peers were also shunning him. Once he had been embraced as a rebellious but charismatic figure, now he was a disgraced celebrity whose personal choices overshadowed his talent. Even his attempts to revive his image were frustrated as the scandal's shadow lingered for years. What remained was this harsh reminder that fame built on charisma and talent could also fall as steeply at the moment when moral outrage was raised and public trust broken. The reality of marriage. Behind the doors of Jerry Lee Lewis and Myra Gale Brown's home, far from the flashing lights and roaring crowds, lay a reality marked by control and isolation. Myra, who entered the marriage at just 13 years old, would later describe a domestic world in which she was cut off from meaningful social connections. Friends were rare, visits with family were limited, and the couple's home became a place where Lewis's rules dictated nearly every aspect of daily life. This isolation kept Myra dependent on him, ensuring she had few places to turn, even as she began to recognize the troubling dynamics of their relationship. While fans saw a glamorous rock star and his wife, Myra lived in an increasingly confined existence, with little support beyond the man who controlled her world. Myra also revealed that the isolation went hand in hand with Jerry Lee's unpredictable temper and violent outbursts. According to her, Lewis was prone to fits of jealousy and rage, during which he would become physically abusive. These episodes were terrifying for Myra, who had little experience or maturity to understand how to protect herself or seek help. His violence was often fueled by his insecurities or suspicions, and it created an environment where Myra was constantly on edge, unsure when the next eruption might come. What might have seemed from the outside like the eccentricities of a passionate artist were, in reality, signs of a dangerous and destructive household. At an unbelievably tender age, such as Myra, the girl is likely to be very much susceptible to manipulation and domination by others. Because she does not yet have any life experiences or emotional tools with which to challenge Lewis or meet her own needs, leaving the marriage hasn't seemed like an option in her mind, given both societal expectations of the time as well as intimidation instilled by Lewis's behavior. In effect, she was trapped young and isolated to find a way out, yet dependent on marriage to see that way out. The imbalance of power defined their lives together under Myra's voice and identity in favor of Lewis's desires and dictates. What started off as a scandalous marriage became for Myra an extremely long time of personal erasure. The world outside seemed pretty different for Myra, for she was a very loyal and supportive wife even behind closed doors. Whenever she was going with Lewis to an event or appearing in some media, it was all about projecting that image of harmony and devotion, with Myra trying desperately to conceal the painful reality of what she went through from day to day. All this took a toll on Myra in terms of her self-image and well-being, because she would be smiling on the outside while suffering on the inside. Many years later, and after the marriage was over, she started talking about the emotional and physical torments endured during her years with Lewis, revealing the dark truth that had been hidden from public view for so long. The walls Myra had built to survive were about to crumble under the weight of a betrayal she never saw coming. The infidelity exposed. The already fragile foundation of Jerry Lee Lewis and Myra Gale Brown's marriage finally cracked under the weight of infidelity. Myra later described the moment she discovered Jerry Lee in bed with another woman as the ultimate betrayal, a scene that shattered whatever illusions she had tried to hold on to about their relationship. This incident wasn't merely a case of marital indiscretion, it was a decisive rupture, a moment that exposed the deep fractures that had long existed beneath the surface. After enduring years of isolation, control, and emotional turmoil, Myra could no longer deny that her loyalty had been repaid with deceit. The sight of Lewis's unfaithfulness was so stark, so undeniable, that it forced her to confront truths she had avoided facing for too long. That was the emotional tipping point at which Myra reconsidered her marriage. Until then, she had done everything she could to maintain the facade of a devoted wife, while, inside, she continued to suffer. She had made excuses for Lewis's violent temper, his jealousy, and his controlling behavior. But seeing the betrayal live took all excuses away from her. It became clear to her that everything she did and sacrificed was of little importance to him. The affair didn't only fluctuate her pride, it struck at the very core of her identity as a wife, questioning her on what, if any, merit she held on to. In Lewis's judgment, this was not an isolated event. Myra began to perceive it in light of the much larger picture, the larger history of serial infidelity through their marriage. Such realization could only deepen that betrayal, as it became obvious that the infidelities of Jerry Lee encompassed more than one weakness. They suggested an ongoing disregard for their vows. Myra's sincere naivety had, up to this point, not enabled her to see the pattern. So the veil had now lifted. The path was clear for her to view how little Lewis actually invested in the partnership, which she had tried to hold up. With such repeated betrayals and years of mistreatment, rationalizing or suffering through the marriage had become impossible for her. In more than a heartbreak, the acknowledgement of the affair became an awakening for Myra. In that instant, she would start to gauge the extent of abuse she had been subjected to, not just as a wife wronged, but as a little girl who had been betrayed and demonized for so many years. The affair had catalyzed a reevaluation of her allegiance not only to Jerry Lee, but to that version of herself that would accept such treatment. This was the beginning of the end, an emotional breaking point that empowered her to take action toward seeking the freedom and self-respect she had been deprived of for so long. The divorce, a final escape. In 1970, after 13 tumultuous years of marriage, Myra Gale Brown took the brave and long overdue step of filing for divorce from Jerry Lee Lewis. The legal filing cited cruelty, adultery, and abandonment. formally documenting the hardships she had endured behind closed doors for over a decade. For Myra, this decision marked the culmination of years of emotional and physical suffering that had begun when she was just 13 years old. Though she had previously tolerated Lewis's violent outbursts, controlling behavior, and repeated infidelities, the betrayal and pain had finally reached an unbearable point. Filing for divorce was not merely a legal action. It was a declaration that she would no longer remain silent or complicit in the destruction of her own well-being. The legal processes that followed matched many of the long-ignored facets of their troubled relationship. It had once been something very private, or something that didn't come above the surface of their public image truth. Abuse, neglect, and infidelity were claimed by Myra in court papers, but such matters starkly contradicted the rock and roll fantasy that had engulfed Lewis's career. The courtroom would be a place that denied the truth about their marriage, kept so long under the appearances. Myra's experience and that public unmasking not only validated everyone for her, but it forced fans and beholders also to face the reality of what had gone on backstage at Lewis's stardom. The hurtful and dramatic life of Myra has come to an end due to the divorce. This marriage opened up under the most scandalous and most traumatic of circumstances, since it was a marriage of a teenage girl to her very much older and very famous cousin, and developed into some sort of ordeal characterized by loneliness, anxiety, and suffering. Death to the marriage added to the compounding several dimensions to this separation. More than just a divorce, it was, in one sense, the end of what had been an extensive captivity for Myra within a very unprotective and non-agential relationship. After suffering from 13 years of meeting the impossible requirements of a husband who consistently betrayed and mistreated her, Myra has finally stepped away from the unhealthy cycle that very much defined her youth and early adulthood. Myra's memoir shocks the public. In 1982, more than a decade after her divorce from Jerry Lee Lewis, Myra Gale Brown found her voice in a powerful and revealing way. She published her memoir, Great Balls of Fire, the uncensored story of Jerry Lee Lewis, offering the world an unflinching look inside a marriage that had long been the subject of gossip and controversy. Until then, much of the public discussion around their relationship had focused on the scandal of Myra's age and their family connection. But in her book, Myra shifted the focus to her lived experience, the daily realities of life as the child bride of a famous but deeply troubled man. With raw honesty, she invited readers into a world few had imagined, where fame and abuse coexisted behind closed doors. Myra's memoir forced back the curtains on evocations of psychological abuse and coercive control she had known all through her formative years. Jealousy, violent temper, and the controlling mentality of Lewis had interfered with every aspect of life. The book sent a painted picture of a little girl robbed of innocence, trapped in a constraining marriage that destroyed her voice and choices systematically. Myra told instances of manipulation, threats, and emotional cruelty that caused her to feel isolated and terrified. She narrated how all the glamour of being a rock star's wife concealed a much darker reality, one where she lived with a constant state of being on edge, never knowing when the next outburst would happen or what might trigger it. Great Balls of Fire have sparked almost immediate and furious public reaction. Readers were taken aback by the great trauma that Myra had divulged, and many had to recast their understandings of the Lewis marriage. A tawdry but colorful one-time tale in rock and roll history was suddenly revealed as a terribly sad story of exploitation and abuse. The memoir told how the one who wanted to cheer a rock star's rebellious spirit did not think seriously enough about the suffering of the little girl next to him. Myra's frank disclosures demolished the glamorous illusion with which the couple surrounded themselves and laid bare the ways in which celebrity might be used to cover over wrongdoing. Through her own battles and fiercest self-advocacy, Myra created the archetype of survival and resilience from once being in the scandalous line of public opinion. By coming forward and telling the story of her agony, she started turning the tide of public opinion and putting her life back together on her own terms. More important for Myra was to be recognized as an example of strength, a woman who went through far beyond unimaginable hardships and found the courage to tell her story than just to be known as Jerry Lee Lewis's child bride. Basically, this memoir is significant, not only because it gives the reader deep insight into her life, but also because it triggers discussions about abuse, power, and the importance of hearing the voices of survivors. Public redemption versus private pain. Most shocking revelations in memoirs and interviews made by Myra Gale Brown further shocked audiences. By the 70s, and the resurgence into a degree of popularity on the country scene, Jerry Lee Lewis was able to redeem himself, at least partially. While rock and roll's scandal of his marrying Myra devastated Lewis's career, the power of time and the loyalty of just enough people allowed him a chance to rebrand. He would become embroiled in several country hits, thereby gaining entrance to reputable venues and awards that, in turn, represented some measure of acknowledgement toward public forgiveness of, or at least forgetting about, the scandal. For Lewis, moving to country music was a kind of redemption, a way for him to reclaim his identity as a flawed but cherished musical icon, rather than one notoriously at the center of one of the grandest scandals in entertainment history. Conversely, the entertainment world dared not come to terms with any of the uncomfortable truths that Myra exposed. There was a reference in the press to her memoir, and an interview drama drew public attention, but there was no reckoning for the abuse she spoke of. There was laudable musical virtuosity to Lewis, and the industry fairly shrugged off the idea of separating art from the artist, even if the artist's real life was intertwined with the damage done. The plausibility of the accusations Myra leveled against Lewis sometimes found itself reduced within the perception of the entertainment realm to mere salacious gossip fodder, thus being knocked from serious consideration or instituted action. The interplay tacitly resided in favor of Lewis basking in the limelight, while Myra's pain stayed marginal. For Myra, the time was a confused and often gloomy fight. As she spoke out bravely or very capital, she was still largely viewed through the lens of the controversial legacy that Jerry Lee Lewis had left behind. To many, she was still the teenage bride from the scandal, and her name was all too often linked to the choices and actions of the man who did her so much harm. The overshadowing of her identity was disheartening and frustrating because it made it difficult for her to be recognized as a person in her own right, a survivor, an author, a woman who had reclaimed her voice. Instead, the public tended to see her as a footnote to the history of Lewis's rise, fall, and partial redemption. What came next was a turning point that finally allowed Myra to step out of the shadows and reclaim the narrative that was always hers. Myra reclaims her story. A potent and contemplative voice has arisen in Myra Gale Brown over the past few decades, sharing reflections on her past with clarity, molded over years of time, healing, and self-examination. Once, she may have spoken out in the raw agony of recent wounds. Today, she speaks of her experience from the point of view of a woman who is willing to try to understand it, then to grow out of it. Talking of abuse and child marriage, Myra recounts not just her traumatic experiences, but also the wisdom that emerged from them over the years. Her efforts at re-exploring these painful life chapters, not for the sole purpose of sensationalism, but for education and activism, represent a profound change in her relationship with her own history. The transformation of her life story, from one that speaks in mere terms of existence to one that tells of resilience and personal growth, has become the most prominent feature of Myra's recent public appearances. Instead of being defined by the scandal surrounding her marriage to Jerry Lee Lewis, she now decides to open her own chapters, instead of letting other people define her narrative. It reflects the strength involved in holding on, freeing oneself, and ultimately healing. She speaks not only as someone who experienced great deprivation, but as someone who has chosen the harder way, the more painful road, to face it, learn from it, and ultimately use it to help fuel her personal transformation. This reframing allows Myra to reclaim what was long denied her, the power to narrate not what was done to her, but how she overcame. In addition to sharing her experience, Myra has gone ahead and advocated for more awareness as far as child marriage and coercive abuse are concerned, especially because these occurrences have often been ignored or silenced in historical contexts. She raises concerns about how societal norms, the existing legal loopholes, as well as the glamorization of celebrity relationships have made these abuses go unchecked. Myra's advocacy highlights that the exploitation and harms done to vulnerable young people in unequal relationships should not be ignored. Rather, it should touch and challenge the excuses or romanticization of such exploitation when it is done by powerful people. Her voice, therefore, brings credibility and urgency to the spelling out of these issues in a broader cultural reckoning, to the systemic conditions that enabled it. If this story left you speechless, make sure to like the video, drop a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts, and subscribe for more untold truths behind the legends. Don't stop here. Click the next video on your screen to uncover even more hidden chapters from music's most shocking scandals.